Louise Brown was the first test tube / in vitro fertilization / IVF baby, and she's celebrating, she's living a healthy life, but a lot has happened in the realm of fertility over the last 40 years, and we know there are a lot of questions out there. Fertility is a big issue in a lot of people's lives, or when people are wrapped up in it, it can be a consuming issue. So we want to try and answer some of your questions. So we are live right now, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube on the CBC pages. If you guys have questions, go down to the comments section and put your question in there. And we're trying to get as many of your questions answered as we can. And to answer those questions, we have two great guests here with us. Dr. Tom Hannum is a fertility doctor. We're actually right now in his clinic in Toronto. And we also have with us Sherry Levitan. She's a fertility lawyer, and she deals with some pretty sticky issues. Now, keep in mind, we are talking always in generalities. We're not talking about specific cases. But, if there's questions that you have had that you feel like you'd like to know more about, more information, go down to the comments. We have two great guests, and we will get your questions answered. I'm going to get us started off. As I mentioned, it's been 40 years since the first in vitro fertilization baby was born. I know you haven't had your clinic for 40 years, but at the same time, I wonder, what do you feel have been the biggest advances in fertility over the last 4 decades?
I think that, there's a couple, from a medical perspective, I think two things. First of all, it's become more socially acceptable. It moved from the fringes, from something that was protested and very complicated, to something that now is supported at a population level. Ontario, for example, will cover IVF now for many patients. And
to be honest, I didn't even know that test tube babies equaled IVF. It wasn't until I started reading about Louise Brown.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that must have transitioned. Test tube baby sounded so clinical.
Doesn't it? And it sounds like a poor baby in a tube, which isn't even what it. No, it's an embryo in a dish. But I guess that terminology. I don't know how it came up.
Yeah. So what have been some of the biggest challenges you feel over 40 years you're still up against?
Well, I think that in some ways we've been very successful. So the IVF has really moved from a bit of a Hail Mary, something that you would do only if it was really all other options have been exhausted, to something that can increasingly be frontline. So, I mean, we're facing a population now where women under tremendous pressure to not have their first baby before they're 30. There's a great Dutch study. If a woman has a baby before she's 30, it's a fraction of lifetime earnings. And at the same time, we know from biology, you're meant to have your family all wrapped up by the time you're 35.
Because we've heard people are waiting a bit too long and running into more issues.
Of course, because look at the pressure. You're meant to have your entire family all done between 30 and 34, right? Between social pressures and biological pressure. So it's into that space that people have to access IVF. And you asked me what might be the biggest challenge or maybe the biggest disappointment. I guess it's the reality that we are still unable to help people with those age-related egg quality changes. So when people are 38 and 40 and 42, we do our best. We're all doing our best, and things can happen. But at a fundamental level, we haven't cracked that code yet.
Yeah, there still is a ceiling.
There is.
So Sherry,
can I just add to that before we
of
move
course.
on? So, when I started this 27 years ago, it was all heterosexual couples, right? And now it's a lot of single people, single men. It's probably the biggest, the fastest growing area of my practice. Single women and gay couples, both male and female. And that changes the dynamic as well. So, when we talk about 30, none of these people are really starting at 30. So it is definitely a slightly older population.
And when it's relationships that are involved between people that are also evolving along with, their fertility capabilities, and I'd imagine it's just, you can get into all sorts of questions and all sorts of scenarios.
Yes, a client recently referred to me as half Jewish mother and half lawyer. And at the time I was, that doesn't sound very good, but it's absolutely true, right? Because they come to me, and my job is to say, okay, what if this? Have you thought about that? What if this changes? And you really
that was your job. That's what they called you.
Yes.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah.
So, and you really have to be able to, look down the runway.
Yeah. And you can't see, you don't have a crystal ball, and it's just...
No, and people are facing things that they haven't, that hasn't been that just hasn't come up before, and they're facing issues. So like a same-sex female couple, for example, they have the opportunity now to both be trying to achieve pregnancy at the same time, and so how do they live that experience? How do they look after their own needs as well as that of their partner, and as well as that of the partnership? You know, and how do they negotiate their joy or confusion when one person achieves pregnancy easily and the other doesn't? And what does that mean for people?
Even within families, I think that can be, it can be sort of tense. You know, one person quite young gets pregnant, another person who's been trying for
like siblings or
years.
something like that.
Yeah,
No, absolutely.
It's difficult. Okay, I just want to say we have lots of great questions coming in. If anybody is just scrolling through, we're talking about fertility. We're taking your questions. Dr. Tom Hannum is a fertility doctor. Sherry Levitan is a fertility lawyer. If you want any of your questions answered, just put them in the comments and we'll do our best. Okay, the first question comes from Rima Tiger, and she's asking, we touched on this a bit, what is the best year for women and men to have babies? What should be the woman's age and what should be the man's age? Actually, you touched a bit on the woman's age, but tell us again, and man's age.
All right, well, I mean, best, we can define that, you know, medically or sociologically. So, so as I was just saying, it's while we all know we're very fertile people when we're 24 and 26, it's a significant choice to choose to have babies then. If it's the right choice for you, that's great, but for many of us, we're still caught up in a lot of different aspects of life, including education, that really limits our ability or perhaps desire to have babies as early as that.
All right, so give us some hard numbers here, though.
All right, so fertility actually stops dropping for women from 28 on, but I don't.
28?
I know, but I don't want to be too caught up in that number. That's a statistical thing. In real life, at around age 31, 32, it's very appropriate to think seriously about the size of family that you want, because it is, for most women, it's going to be straightforward to get pregnant when they're 34, and for most men, it's going to be straightforward to be a father when they're 40.
40.
Yeah, but what we often forget about is we're thinking about our first baby, and what we should really be thinking about is family planning. How many children do you want to have? Because if a woman is 34 and she's just about to start trying to get pregnant, and let's acknowledge that most people are fortunate enough they do get pregnant quickly. Perhaps she'll deliver when she's 35 and breastfeed till she's 36, and by the time she's 37, wants to try again. And if she had plans to have 3 children, then this story is going until she's 39 or 40, and that's the complexity. It's not just about when you start trying, it's about finishing your family and doing so in a time that still feels safe.
I think that is amazing advice, because just personally speaking, I agree. I have 2 children, but if I was younger, I would have had one more. But I wasn't thinking about the last, I was thinking about the first.
Well, Christine, so that's where into this space now is where people are looking into fertility preservation, because it works. If a woman is under 35 and has a good ovarian reserve, she can freeze eggs. And you know, there's some, when you freeze eggs, you don't know if you're freezing good quality eggs or not. It's no guarantee, but what it might do is help delay. It might help someone achieve pregnancy naturally a first time or a second time, and it's their future selves, their 38-year-old or 40-year-old selves, who might actually need to look seriously at egg donation. And at that point, she would have had her own eggs frozen. That's the value. That and egg freezing works. It works now. It didn't work very well like 5 years ago. Even 3-4 years ago, but the technology has really caught up.
But it does sound like something you need to start thinking about around the age of 30.
Really?
Like start really figuring it out.
I spend a great part of my day with 40-year-old women who had no problem conceiving the first child and had no idea that this would be a possibility, and they're faced with donor egg, and that's, you know, for a lot of them it's heartbreaking. So forward planning, it's a good thing.
Yeah, well, and
great
people
advice.
are able to now, like the technology has allowed that to happen.
All right, let's try to get to another question here. Oh, this is a good one. Let's start talking money.
Okay.
Why isn't IVF free in Canada?
Sure,
Who'd like to take that
Why
on?
is IVF not free in Canada?
So it used to be, right? Up until 1994, 3 rounds of IVF were covered by OHIP, and then, you know, governments change and priorities change, and budgets become a little tighter, and they deregulated it and put it into the private sector. And I remember at the time sitting down with some physicians, and they were quite certain that their business was over because OHIP wasn't funding it. So there are certainly critics who would say it's not a necessary medical process, but I think we would disagree quite strongly with that.
I had no idea that at one point it was free. My understanding, it's still supported financially in Quebec?
It was. It's no longer.
It's no
You know, every
longer.
province deals with it
Okay.
separately. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like any remuneration issue in medicine, it immediately becomes complicated and political. Now, we work in this space, so we're biased, but yes, you know, I think we can acknowledge as Canadians, healthcare is more than just keeping us alive. It's about quality of life, and anyone who has a family or who's wanted to have a family larger than just themselves would relate to the statement that fertility is a central part of health. Now, how does one fund that in such a way that it protects everybody, including taxpayers? I think there's a lot of interesting conversations to be had there. In medicine, some groups that are doing remuneration are interested in paying for outcomes rather than access to service, which would be an interesting spin for fertility for sure. Mm-hmm. What if there was a solution that only paid care providers based on a successful outcome?
Wow.
I know.
That would be.
I know. It seems to me that would be, as a taxpayer, that sounds fair to me.
Well, they'd stop doing IVF on 44-year-olds, that's for sure.
Well, it would stop people from trying 8 times. There were some problems in Quebec with people trying many times with low success rates, which I can argue is an individual's prerogative, but it might not be something that should be supported at a national level.
What's the average cost of one IVF cycle? I know it varies widely, and it probably varies, but if you could give me a range, what's roughly the cost?
So I think the range actually is considerable, and it's actually one of the problems of our field, because as costs go up, so can success rates. Mm-hmm. So I'll start at a low end. In Ontario, it's possible to access funded IVF. So with relatively short wait lists, a couple can do their first IVF cycle for no more than the cost of medications. And those medications, for some, will be covered by private insurance plans. That's best case scenario. Mm-hmm. But if they're not covered, medication costs are routinely $3,000 to $7,000, and we're talking numbers like that. So for a couple who are in a position where they're looking to private pay, I would say $8,000 to $15,000 in that range is common, and it can be higher than that, because we're in a position now to help couples not only create a lot of embryos, but do genetic profiling of those embryos.
So there's a lot that can be done.
Right, because when you start to screen embryos for health, there's a lot to be said for that. You know, in biology, embryos implant, and then everyone's hopeful that the pregnancy will be ongoing, and sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not. First trimester losses or outcomes like Down syndrome, which put people in a very complicated position. Whereas you can do all that screening now at the embryo level, but it costs money.
Right.
You know, the genetic.
Nothing's free.
Right.
Nothing's free.
If you're a couple who have one of the carrying cystic fibrosis or SMA or some genetic disease, you could do a complete screen for those embryos, find the embryos that will be unaffected. That's beautiful. I mean, it's a beautiful thing, but I just described a $20,000 to $25,000 IVF procedure. So we're talking about broad access in some circumstances, but this is definitely second tier or third tier medicine, however you want to call it.
Yeah, for
as
sure.
well.
While we're talking about PGS, if you're working with a surrogate is not going to hang around and wait for you forever, right? So there's pretty much a time limit on how long a surrogate is going to be ready, willing, and able to undergo transfers. If you're able to screen those embryos and you know that the embryo being transferred has the right number of chromosomes, then you're increasing the chances of a fast pregnancy, and that increases your chances of getting to a live birth, you know, with that particular surrogate.
It was all really great information. Okay, let's try to get, in case you guys are just joining us, we're taking your questions on fertility. Just put them down in the comments and we will do our best to get them answered. Okay, this next question comes from Alicia Cohn. I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. Okay, this is for you, Sherry. She's asking, what happens when the Declaration of Parentage is not signed?
Oh, okay.
So what's the circumstance here?
So in some provinces, the people who are recognized as the intended parents from the get-go are not really the parents. So in Ontario, until about a year and a half ago, if a baby was born to a surrogate, she was presumed to be the mother. And that's not the person that you want to be on the birth certificate. So we had to go to court. We had to ask the court to order that the intended parents were the actual parents of record. That's changed. And so in Ontario right now, as long as you have a surrogacy agreement signed before the embryo transfer, as long as the surrogate had independent counsel and the intended parents had independent counsel, and as long as the surrogate consents after birth, we can register the baby easily. Not quite as simply as if you had given birth to your own child, but without a court order. So there are still provinces that require that court order. It's not called a declaration of parentage in every province, but in Ontario, we don't need it anymore.
But Sherry, that requires the surrogate sign something after delivery.
Yes, no sooner than 8 days. On the child's 8th day of life, she can sign.
There's an obligation to do it though after delivery.
Yes.
You can't do it all beforehand.
No, nowhere in Canada can you do it beforehand.
Interesting.
There are certain states where you can get a pre-birth order, but not here.
There's some vulnerability then for intended parents.
Academically, yes. Realistically, I've done thousands, and knock on something that's lumber related. Haven't had trouble. Yeah.
All right. Well, it sounds like it's been an evolving situation, but it's starting.
Oh, absolutely,
to,
absolutely.
Okay. The next question comes from Marianne Cullen. So grateful for IVF. I never would have had my baby boy otherwise. Even though the Quebec government doesn't cover it anymore, it was money well spent. I wonder if they'll cover it again going forward. So, do you guys see anything more on the horizon? Do you think as we go forward, there might be money for it?
I think people are following this Ontario experiment very closely. So the way they set it up, Ontario, was to cap the costs to taxpayers. So it's a set amount every year. In Quebec, the solution they put in place was more like insurance really is, which is to say, it was endless. The costs were spiraling out of control.
And you mentioned people were doing many times.
Right. So it comes down to how the policy is implemented, and I think many Canadian provinces are watching the Ontario experiment, and it's still new. I think we're into our 3rd year, so we won't be watching costs spiral out, and together we're going to learn to see if it's actually turned out to be good policy as well.
We also limit the intended mother's age. So the woman going through IVF has to be 43 or younger. There were no limits in Quebec.
Okay.
Yeah.
So again, an evolving situation.
Yep.
And
right.
so,
yeah.
Marianne, it sounds like we'll have to wait and see, but it sounds like there's potential.
There genuinely is. From people who are on the inside, they are certainly using the Ontario case to try to promote the idea in other provinces.
All right. Justin Carter, it's nice to hear from a guy as well. Why don't people just adopt?
Oh,
yeah.
Can Sherry speak to the difficulties around that? So how hard is adoption?
So, people think that, there are all these babies out there that need homes, and wouldn't it be wonderful, if we provided homes for them? And the reality is there aren't all these babies. It is really hard to adopt a newborn, and most of the newborns come with medical issues. So most of the and I don't practice in the field of adoption, so if I get something a little bit wrong, somebody will tell me, I'm sure. But most of the newborns are coming from the Native Canadian population, and access to healthcare is less than stellar. And so there are a lot of medical issues.
Well, it was different a generation ago because there's been 2 significant developments. One is the relative ease of access to the birth control pill, or now intrauterine devices, and the other is the relative ease of access to abortions, to therapeutic abortion. So between those 2 chances for women to control their fertility, it is a much rarer event now for a healthy child to come to term, but then be given up for adoption to the broader community. And while it does happen, and it's beautiful for the parents to have that opportunity, it's so rare that for a long time Canadians were often looking overseas, and those channels have been closed down as well. So there's simply not as much opportunity as. That's my answer to Jason. It's just not that. It's not.
Yeah, and society has changed. Now people will take care of unwed mothers, and there's not that stigma around
Perhaps
to give up babies, along with birth control, along with closing borders and things like that. So it sounds like a lot has evolved, and that's
it has. But for an individual or couple who are hoping to broaden the size of their family, they are obligated to look to fertility clinics as their only solution in many cases.
Right. Okay, we have a question from Ryan. Ryan Clark is asking a bit of a broader question. How can society overcome the stigmas around IVF and the challenges related to accepting natural fertility problems? Oh, that's a great question, Ryan.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Who would like to take that on? How do we?
So I think a lot of it has to do with education, right? And I think that we have to start that at a much younger age. But it can flip both ways. I have met children born through IVF who felt, that they were extra special, right? Because their parents had to go through such lengths. So it's about how we frame it, but also there's the education and the expectations, and we have to understand that a certain percentage of the population and 100% of the LGBTQ community are going to have to resort to fertility intervention, and thank God that we have, decent access.
But these judgments run deep.
Do they?
When we speak to patients, the pride that individuals, you can see them when I'm able to tell someone they have a great number of eggs or great sperm, the guys are super transparent about that. You have great what? and which is fun and great, but that also the corollary is there too. So that means when I have to tell someone that actually their sperm count is lower, they're not motile, or that there's a dramatic increase in erectile dysfunction that follows that, which is tragic, right? And it's not, there was clearly, and they know this, there's no fault, and yet not just here in Canada, but I would argue cross-culturally, the association of a broader family and virility or fecundity has always been very important. And so I hope that over time we're able to have easier conversations about this. I think opportunities like this to talk about it, and I'm always grateful for any patient who chooses to share their stories, good or bad, just because it increasingly normalizes something that we know is normal. We know it is, but it runs really deep.
It does, and people tend not to talk about it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So which I think,
although I feel that shifting slightly, and I think it's, as we talked about the cost, I think that in a lot of cases IVF is discussed openly in certain subsections of the population.
All right.
So I do feel like, when you have a group of people who have, there's a reasonable number of them that have had fertility issues, they'll talk about it openly. And that's usually because they've had the financial means to do these. It is such a struggle.
Right.
At the same time, one of the arguments, one of the questions I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about is, sometimes you'll hear people say, and I don't think Ryan is asking this, is that if somebody can't have children and you help them have children, what's the likelihood that their children won't be able to have children?
I can answer that, and the answer is it depends on the underlying diagnosis, but there are certainly things that are getting passed from generation to generation. There's one study that came out very recently suggesting that children, so male factor is when the sperm count is awry, and that boys born of fathers with male factor are more likely to have male factor themselves. It's intuitive that would be the case. Now there are some, increasingly, however, there are some ways to mitigate those risks. So, for example, if we were really worried about passing male factor along, it might be on the Y chromosome, then you could choose through genetic testing to have a girl. Now,
but not legally.
Well,
I was going to say,
right. Not in Canada.
Not in Canada.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
You cannot do gender selection. The laws are a little confused about it because you can do it for medical reasons, but then you have to define what those medical reasons are.
Right, and the physicians take on some liability as well. So I would say that, head to Chicago, yes.
The bottom line is there are opportunities to mitigate those risks, but we need a conversation to decide as a society if that's what we want to do.
Right.
Because we are not currently, as a society, choosing to intervene at the embryo level to influence health outcomes later on. It's going to come up for Canadians. I'm sure you're familiar with CRISPR, the idea that we can start to edit embryos. Now, we're not doing this in Canada, and it's not legal to do so in Canada, but Canada isn't the world. This is happening, and as a society, we're going to have to make some decisions pretty quickly as to how we want to handle this.
This is a great discussion. In case you're just scrolling by on the CBC's Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube page, stop and come join us. We're having a chat about fertility. Last week was the 40th birthday of the first IVF in vitro fertilization baby, Louise Brown. She looks like she's doing great. But we're talking about what's happened over the last 40 years, and we're taking your questions. And we've had some great questions so far. So let's get back to them.
Can I add one point to this last
Absolutely.
conversation? So we've talked about people not being forthcoming about their struggles. It becomes even more so with heterosexual couples who need egg donors, right? They become very, very quiet about it. And in the media, we see lots and lots of celebrities who are having children in their late
Yes.
40s or early 50s, and they're not talking about
Yeah.
whether their embryos were frozen 10 years ago or whether they're using egg donors. And I think it's setting a false expectation for the
Absolutely.
patient population, right? Because, you know, we know how fertility takes a nosedive, and when you're 45, it's not going to happen naturally.
Do you think that message is out more now, though?
I don't know. I think it's probably men who are perpetuating it a little bit. You know,
I agree with that.
right?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I feel though that we live all our lives online, and I feel that the resources that are available to patients now are extraordinary. I feel like there's, in every respect, there's fewer secrets, and it doesn't take very long to figure these things out now, if people choose
But I
to.
take
Right.
Sherry's point in that it becomes difficult, and I think when people see these examples, I think Janet Jackson had a baby
Right.
in her 50s.
And Bridget Nielsen just had one
Yeah.
at 54.
I mean,
yeah.
it does sort of make people think, well, it's possible.
Right.
It is,
Right.
but you know, it goes back to the expense we talked about. A lot is possible. Can you afford to do all that? And when you come up against it and you've waited that long,
Can you afford, and can you make the choices that would allow that outcome to happen for you? Because you might be able to achieve having a baby, but it might not be the way that you
Right.
thought it was going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we've got a number of questions that are coming, so we're going to try to get through as many of them. The first one, Stacey Elizabeth is asking, what is the % chance stat of IVF conception for a first-time in vitro session? Okay, so what's the success rate?
Canadian
for
average
first
is
time?
around 32%, and but the way it works is we over about 10 days we would encourage a woman to take the fertility hormones, because then she'll be able to grow a lot of eggs, and on average it takes about 12 eggs to have a baby. So if a woman's in the position to be able to actually make 24 eggs at a time, from those 24 eggs, they won't all fertilize, they won't all turn into healthy embryos, but the math would say she could transfer one embryo now and have a baby, 2 years later come back and anticipate having a second baby. So the Canadian average success rate is 30% per transfer, but if a couple are fortunate, they'll have more than one transfer opportunity to enjoy that success.
But every patient's particular information will influence the data. So the best thing a patient can do is ask his or her physician, based on my age, based on my circumstances, what is your experience?
For our good prognosis patients coming through right now, each embryo transfer yields a 74% chance for pregnancy.
Wow.
So it really, if you are in a position to be able to access care while there's still opportunities for success, then they can be very high.
So it can vary, but a lot can depend on who you are and what state.
Yep.
Okay, Stacey, I hope that answers your question. Next question from Louis Rumsfeld is asking, at what point do you tell a couple that treatment is I think he means no longer viable, and that they should look into adoption? So I'd imagine this is a really difficult conversation, but
Isn't it?
you've done all you could.
And how do we define that? And, you know, it's an interesting time in medicine. I was alluding to the fact that all information is available online now, and I think our roles as clinicians is increasingly to become counselors, to be able to help people find the right decision for them, because there's no line in the sand. But at what success rate would you find an intervention inappropriate? So I think a 74% success rate, 74% is awesome. So for someone who had that opportunity, I would be really encouraging them to
But
try.
if I was sitting in the 26%, at what point do you?
And if you've done this once, or twice, and if I'm sitting across from you and I'm saying, as far as I can tell, your personal history, I think there's a 3% chance, or I've got this paper showing that in your circumstance it's a 0.6% chance. Is that appropriate to keep trying? Is it?
Or if the goal is to become a parent, what other avenues can we have? And it might be adoption, but it also might be egg donation or a surrogacy.
Yeah.
So Dr. Hannum, do you have that moment with patients sometimes where you say to them, I think we should, there are resources to look into adoption?
Yeah, the problem is I've been wrong. So there was a couple. Can you believe it? No. Can you believe that?
I'm going to write that down.
Ridiculous pause. No, so I was trying to help a couple stop doing IVF. They'd done it 3 times. And they're like, we're doing it again. I really didn't want them to do it again. And they did it again. And it didn't work. I'm like, we really have, and they were going to do it again. They got a ton of second opinions. Of course, you can always find someone to help you. I'm like, okay, I will help you.
I'll give it a try.
I'll give it, and then they had a baby. So now what's the learning point there? It's a terrible story, right? All that tells us is no one knows anything, and if you just keep trying, what's that? What's that about? I think people have to be very careful, because while that happened, there's many times when it doesn't.
Right.
And resources are limited, so you have to make a choice.
Well,
it seems like you have to take that into consideration, and emotionally, it's a
Absolutely.
long, draining process.
You really have to look out for yourself and your partner and your family, and it's not just, it's expensive, and I don't just mean money. It's in every respect.
Yep.
Big choices.
Okay, Louis, I hope that answers your question. This next one is an interesting one. It comes from Lizelle Rose, and she's asking, are you able to pick a friend to be a surrogate?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they are generally the best situation, somebody that you know and love and trust. And it changes the dynamic completely. So the intended parents are typically a little bit more respectful, which is always a good thing. And as long as the friend has the ability to say no. So as long as she's acting really of her own consent, and she meets with the counselor, she meets with a lawyer, and something she really wants to do, and she's an appropriate surrogate, it's fantastic. It gets a little complicated in family situations, because there might be a lot of pressure from mom for one sister to carry for another, and the sister may not want to do it. But in the friend zone, if somebody's offered, then it's probably a good situation and worth exploring.
Those are really within the family. My initial thought was that it would be easier within a family, but I know somebody who, same scenario of sisters, wanted an egg donation from the other sister, and it turned out they did some tests. She didn't feel she could say no, but she wasn't really sure she wanted to say yes. They said her egg quality wasn't the greatest, so she ended up being off the hook. But she said, I really don't know. I kept picturing us at family gatherings thinking that's my daughter.
Forever.
Forever.
Yeah.
It's a really complex set of relationships.
Especially if the younger sister who's going to donate doesn't have her own children. I think it's a lot to ask.
Okay, I hope that answers your question, Lizelle. Great question. This question comes from YouTube. Oh, this is good. Up to what age can a man have children in terms of sperm quality?
Wow, that is a great question.
To say that you can maybe isn't the same as you can. And
let me answer that question from a strictly medical perspective, not a sociological one.
Okay.
I think that so men are in the position where they have stem cells that are building sperm throughout their life, but over time those stem cells will get increasingly damaged. So, nature designed men so that the sperm, that those stem cells are kept at a different temperature, but over time they will start to break down. So for men over age 45 or over age 50 or 55, we can really start to measure the differences. And what happens is the DNA starts to fragment. Now, all men have DNA in the sperm that fragments a little bit. And the way that nature's handled that is the DNA is presented in a compact form to the egg, it's opened up, and the egg fixes those little fragments. So if it's going to be highly fragmented sperm, you want an extremely capable egg. So here's the unfortunate part, is that an age difference between that older man and the much younger woman is what's going to result in a much healthier baby.
Wow. I did not see that going there.
I know.
And I'm
that.
thinking,
I
look how
just said
smart
that.
the egg is, right?
I know.
Yes.
So there we are. So for couples, what that means is in real life that plays out in a difficult way, because a
Right.
woman who is 38, we've been talking about age as it relates to egg quality, and so 38 for many women it can be a successful age, but not everybody. The egg quality might be starting to change, and if her life partner is 58, then actually the combination can be very difficult for that couple.
That's, I gotta say, that's really great information. I just noticed the time. Dr. Hannum has an appointment at 1 o'clock, so we're gonna have to wrap this up.
Okay.
I wanna thank you guys so much. This has been such a great discussion and really informative. I mean, we do stories on the topics, and then I hear you guys chat, and I'm like, wow, I hadn't actually thought about that. So thank you. Sherry Levitan is a fertility lawyer here in Toronto. Dr. Tom Hannum, busy fertility doctor. He's going to run off in the clinic now.
Christine.
And thank all of you. Thanks for your great questions on YouTube, on Twitter, and on Facebook. And we'll see you guys next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I just saw the
Sherry.
notes, and then I looked at the time, and I'm like, oh, right, you had to do something at 1 o'clock, right?
Make a baby.
I'm really
Make a baby at
Maybe
1
that's
o'clock.
I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have shared this time with you, Sherry. It's really interesting, and for